Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we are diving deep into the incredible story of a nation that covers nearly half of an entire continent. It's a place really forged in sugar, gold, and a revolution that, get this, crowned an emperor instead of a president. This is a concise history of Brazil. So, that's the big question, right? How on earth did a Portuguese colony, which kind of felt like an afterthought in the Americas, grow into this continental giant we know today? That's what we're going to unpack. So, to get our heads around this huge story, we've broken it down into 5 key parts. We'll start way back with the land before Brazil, then look at how the colonial engine got built. We'll see the totally unique creation of an empire in the Americas, navigate the chaotic era of republics and revolutions, and finally, buckle up for modern Brazil's wild ride. Okay, first up, let's go back in time. We're exploring the land before Brazil, a history that started thousands and thousands of years before any European ships even spotted the coastline. You know, long before the Portuguese ever arrived, this was an ancient and really populated place. We're talking human presence going back at least 11,000 years. We know this thanks to Luzia woman, one of the oldest skeletons ever found in the Americas. And let's be clear, this was anything but an empty land. It was this vibrant world, home to maybe 2,000 different tribes. Some of them formed these incredibly complex societies, like the Marjoara culture right at the mouth of the Amazon. I mean, they were creating this beautiful, sophisticated pottery and building massive earthworks, supporting a population that might have been as big as 100,000 people. Just incredible. Well, that vibrant world was about to be completely and forever changed. And that brings us to our second chapter, the colonial engine. This was the period that would forge a new nation, built on extraction and, tragically, on enslavement. The whole colonial economy was really defined by these boom and bust cycles. It all kicked off with Brazil wood. It's a tree that produces this amazing red dye, and it was so valuable it literally gave the country its name. Then came the Sugar Age. Starting in the 1500s, huge plantations up in the Northeast became the absolute economic backbone of the colony. But everything shifted again in the 1700s when gold and diamonds were discovered inland. That sparked this massive rush to the region we now call Minas Gerais, which, you guessed it, means general mines. And we have to be really clear about what fueled that colonial engine. It was human lives. More than 5 million enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to Brazil. Just think about that number for a second. It's the largest number for any single country in the Americas by far. And the vast majority were forced to work and die on those sugar plantations that were powering the entire colonial economy. But enslavement was always met with fierce resistance. This quote is from Zumbi dos Palmares, the last leader of the Quilombo dos Palmares. Now, a Quilombo was a community built by people who had escaped slavery, and Palmares was the biggest one, a self-sufficient republic that actually survived for almost 100 years. Zumbi's defiance just symbolizes this powerful truth, that even in the face of just unimaginable brutality, the fight for freedom never ever died. That fight would eventually lead to independence, but Brazil's journey was completely different from its neighbors. And this brings us to Chapter 3, an empire in the Americas. Okay, the story here is just wild. It all starts in 1808 when Napoleon invades Portugal. This forces the entire Portuguese royal court to pack up and flee across the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro. Suddenly, for the first time ever, a European colony becomes the center of its own empire. So when the government back in Portugal eventually demanded the Prince Regent, Dom Pedro, come home, he famously refused, declaring, "Il fico," I am staying. A little while later, he declared Brazil's independence, not as a republic, but as an empire, with himself as the emperor. And this monarchy lasted all the way until 1889, falling just 1 year after Princess Isabel finally signed the Golden Law, which abolished slavery for good. And this really highlights just how different Brazil's path was. I mean, while the rest of Spanish America was shattering into a whole bunch of different republics through these bloody, long wars, Brazil took a completely different turn. Its transition was an imperial declaration, not a popular revolution. And because of that unique path, it managed to hold its vast territory together, becoming the single, huge empire in a sea of fractured republics. But, as you might guess, the empire wouldn't last. The next chapter is one of constant change and upheaval. Section 4, Republics and Revolutions, a century of pure political turmoil. So the First Republic was dominated by this really interesting political setup called the Política do Café com Leite, which translates to the coffee with milk policy. Now, this wasn't an actual law, but it was basically a gentleman's agreement where the super powerful elites from the coffee state of São Paulo and the dairy state of Minas Gerais would just trade the presidency back and forth. It effectively locked out the entire rest of the country from having any real power. Well, this coffee with milk republic got overthrown in 1930 in a military coup that put a man named Getúlio Vargas in power, kicking off a long period of authoritarian rule. After a brief democratic period after World War II, another military coup in 1964 plunged the country into a harsh dictatorship that lasted for 21 long years. It wasn't until 1985 that civilian rule was finally restored. It was, to put it mildly, a century defined by instability. You know, the legacy of that dictatorship is incredibly complex. On one hand, the period saw enormous economic growth, an era that people often called the Brazilian miracle. But on the other hand, this came at a truly terrible human cost. The regime was responsible for widespread human rights abuses. Official reports later confirmed that hundreds were killed or disappeared, and that an estimated 20,000 people were tortured. And that brings us right into our final section, the return to democracy, and this ongoing, often difficult, search for stability. Section 5, Modern Brazil's Wild Ride. Ever since Brazil returned to democracy in '85, it has been on an absolute political roller coaster. A new constitution in '88 and a brilliant plan to crush hyperinflation in '94 brought some real stability. The 2000s saw the historic election of the country's first leftist president, Lula da Silva, but the next decade brought chaos. Despite hosting the World Cup and the Olympics, the country was just rocked by massive protests and a giant corruption scandal that ended with the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff. All this upheaval paved the way for the 2018 election of the far-right Congressman Jair Bolsonaro, whose presidency was largely defined by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, in a truly dramatic turn of events, Lula made a political comeback and returned to the presidency in 2023. It's just been a period of absolutely dizzying change. So when you look at it all, if there's one constant in Brazil's history, it's reinvention. From those ancient indigenous societies to a colonial engine, from an American empire to a turbulent republic, the nation has just continually reshaped itself over and over again. And that really leaves us with the big open question: what will its next chapter be? Hey, if you found this whirlwind tour through Brazilian history as fascinating as we did, definitely go check out our playlist for more quick, concise country history.